Under the gray dawn of August 17, 1943, the skies above northern Germany trembled. It began as a low, distant hum, an indistinct vibration rolling over rooftops, through church spires, and across the Rhine Valley. Then came the thunder. The sound grew until it became a living thing, a storm of engines roaring high above the clouds. Factory workers in Regensburg looked up from the assembly lines, shielding their eyes from the blinding sun. Tiny silver glints appeared, first dozens, then hundreds. By the time the air raid sirens wailed, it was too late. They were coming. The B-17 flying fortresses of the U.S. 8th Air Force filled the heavens in formation so vast that it seemed endless. Row after row of four-engine bombers stretched from horizon to horizon, their wings gleaming like polished armor. German anti-aircraft crews in black uniforms scrambled to their guns, loading 88mm shells as spotters shouted headings into field telephones. 200 Bombenflugzeuge über Regensburg, the observers screamed. 200 bombers over Regensburg, then 300, then more. The scale defied belief. Only months before, Luftwaffe officers had laughed at the notion that America's fledgling air arm could ever strike deep inside the Reich. Their crews will never survive, one colonel had boasted to a war correspondent, smirking as he poured his coffee. Their planes are too slow, their tactics primitive. They'll burn before they reach Berlin. Those words would echo bitterly now. At 27,000 feet, the fortresses opened their bomb bays. The world below turned into a mosaic of targets, aircraft plants, ball-bearing factories, fuel depots, train yards. Down there, men and women who had once mocked the idea of weak American airmen now stared in horror as the black dots began to fall. In seconds, the dots became screaming trails of destruction, each carrying hundreds of pounds of TNT. Then the first explosions tore through the industrial heart of Germany. Fireballs rolled skyward. The roar was deafening. Windows shattered miles away. Flames consumed rows of warehouses, casting an orange glare that painted the underbellies of the bombers above. A witness later recalled that the sky looked as though it were raining fire. But this was not chaos, it was choreography. Each B-17 flew in a tight, disciplined combat box formation, an innovation designed to concentrate firepower and maintain accuracy under fire. Waist gunners, sweating behind twin .50 caliber Brownings, scanned the skies for Messerschmitts diving from the sun. Radio operators barked clipped commands through headsets as their planes shook with the recoil of returning fire. Keep formation. Do not break. For the German defenders, the scale of the assault was almost beyond comprehension. Radar operators at Würzburg stations had tracked the incoming formations for over an hour, but disbelief lingered until the first bombs fell. This was no pinprick raid. It was a strategic thunderclap, the first signal that the Allies intended not merely to harass, but to annihilate the machinery that sustained Hitler's war. Back in 1941, Germany's own bombers had ruled the skies over Europe. The Luftwaffe had swept across Poland, France, and the Low Countries with near impunity. Britain's cities had burned under the Blitz. Yet now, in 1943, the tables were turning. America's industrial power, once underestimated, often ridiculed, was awakening. In factories across the Midwest, in places like Seattle, Wichita, and Long Beach, engineers and assembly workers labored day and night, building the metal giants that now darkened the German sky. Each B-17 represented tens of thousands of man-hours, riveters hammering aluminum skin, machinists crafting engines, women testing instruments by lamplight. They were, as one pilot later said, the embodiment of a nation's will in steel and fuel. At the height of production, Boeing's Seattle plant was rolling out one completed B-17 every 63 minutes, a staggering pace that Germany could scarcely imagine. But sheer numbers were not enough. Strategy mattered. American air doctrine rested on a bold, almost reckless idea: daylight precision bombing. While the British struck by night, the U.S. Army Air Forces believed that their bombers, heavily armed, tightly organized, and guided by cutting-edge Norden bomb sights, could destroy specific industrial targets with surgical precision. It was a concept as daring as it was deadly. To the Luftwaffe, daylight raids seemed suicidal. They will be massacred, General Galland predicted. In the early months, he was almost right. American formations attacking Bremen and Schweinfurt suffered appalling losses. Crews spoke in hushed tones about the black puffs of flak and the sudden flash of cannon shells that ripped through aluminum hulls like paper. Entire squadrons vanished over the North Sea. But the Americans kept coming. What the Germans didn't yet grasp was that each mission, each loss, was part of a grander evolution, a test of endurance that America could afford and Germany could not. Every downed fortress was replaced, every fallen crew avenged by 10 more rising from English airfields. The Americans were learning fast, adjusting routes, refining formations, improving gunnery, and, above all, perfecting coordination. By mid-1943, the 8th Air Force had transformed from a scattered experiment into a formidable hammer. Thousands of airmen were now stationed across dozens of bases in East Anglia, Thorpe Abbotts, Bassingbourn, Kimbolton, each base a small city of maintenance crews, ordnance men, and engineers. Their target lists grew bolder: Hamburg, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, Bremen, and, eventually, Berlin itself. Inside Germany, the laughter faded. Luftwaffe pilots began to note with unease the changing nature of their enemy. "The Americans fly in walls," one wrote in his logbook. "We dive and shoot, but the wall shoots back." The cost of defending the Reich skyrocketed. Every mission forced the Luftwaffe to scramble hundreds of interceptors, fighters that burned precious fuel and wore down engines already strained by constant operations. And still, the bomber streams came. Each time they returned to England, they brought back photographs, grainy, black and white evidence of destruction, factories gutted, power stations silenced, refineries reduced to ash. For the men on the ground, the sound of those engines became synonymous with dread. Workers in Kassel, Hamburg, and Essen began to refer to the American bombers simply as Die Fliegenden Festungen, the flying fortresses. Their approach meant death, not just for soldiers, but for the heart of German industry itself. By late summer, whispers spread through the Luftwaffe: the Americans were preparing something larger, something unprecedented. Intelligence intercepts spoke of massive fuel allocations, of new formations being assembled across England, of a combined strike designed to cripple Germany's air production entirely. Officers debated whether such an operation was even possible. Could the Americans really sustain a raid deep into Bavaria and back again? Could they coordinate hundreds, perhaps thousands, of bombers over enemy territory for hours on end? The answer would soon come, carried on the wings of those silver giants. As dawn broke on August 17, their contrails painted the sky in endless white ribbons stretching toward the heart of the Reich. Below, flak batteries readied their shells. Above, bomber crews steadied their hands. The air war over Europe was about to change forever. And the secret behind America's once weak Air Force, its real strength, was about to be revealed in fire and iron. The secret behind America's transformation from an underdog to an unstoppable aerial juggernaut lay not only in its courage but in its machinery, and the genius behind that machinery. What German intelligence had failed to grasp was that while the Luftwaffe clung to its tactical edge, nimble fighters, daring pilots, close air support, the Americans were building a war of precision, mathematics, and metal. Their advantage wasn't in the dogfight. It was in the equation. The key was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, an aircraft conceived in the mid-1930s by a team led by engineers Edward Curtis Wells and E.G. Ed Wells, refined in wind tunnels at Boeing Field, and tested in the harsh skies over Washington state. Its design defied the conventions of its age, for Wright are 1820 Cyclone radial engines, each generating 1,200 horsepower, driving a plane that could climb to 35,000 feet and haul 4,000 pounds of bombs over 2,000 miles. At full throttle, its cruising speed reached 150 knots. But its true power was its resilience. With armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a dozen .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in nose, tail, waist, top, and belly turrets, it could defend itself in every direction. Crews came to trust their fortresses as living companions, machines that could take punishment beyond belief. Veterans told stories of B-17s returning to England with tails nearly severed, wings shredded, or engines on fire, yet still landing on one wheel. A German pilot who examined a downed B-17 marveled, "It is built like a tank that flies." The Americans had learned that endurance wins air wars. But even the mightiest aircraft needed brains to hit with precision. The secret sat beneath a sheet of glass at the bomber's nose, the Norden bomb sight. Developed by Dutch engineer Carl Norden and American technician Theodore Barth, it was a gyroscopic wonder of its time. The bomb sight allowed bombardiers to calculate trajectories based on airspeed, altitude, and wind drift, enabling them to drop ordnance with an accuracy once thought impossible from high altitude. Each Norden unit cost about $8,000, more than a house in 1942, and was guarded as a state secret. Crews swore an oath to destroy it if their plane went down. When linked with the B-17's autopilot system, the Norden effectively turned the bomber into a flying machine of mathematics, holding its course automatically while the bombardier adjusted crosshairs. The theory was audacious, that disciplined precision bombing could break the enemy's ability to wage war without obliterating entire cities. The Regensburg-Schweinfurt raid of August 17, 1943, would test that theory to its limits. That morning, as over 376 B-17s roared toward southern Germany, another formation aimed for Schweinfurt, the beating heart of Germany's ball-bearing industry. The mission was codenamed Double Strike. Its plan: hit both cities simultaneously, stretching German defenses until they snapped. It was a masterpiece of coordination, but it also demanded that every plane, every man, and every machine perform perfectly. Over Regensburg, the first wave reached their target at 11:25 a.m. German radar had tracked them for hours, and by the time they arrived, over 300 Luftwaffe fighters, Bf-109s and Fw-190s from Jägerschwader 3 and 26, were waiting. The sky erupted into chaos. Fighters screamed through the bomber formations, cannons flashing. Gunners aboard the B-17s answered in controlled bursts, filling the air with tracers that arced like fiery comets. At the lead, Colonel Curtis LeMay's formation pressed on. LeMay, who would later command the Strategic Air Command, was known for his cold precision and iron discipline. "Stay tight. Keep formation," his order went out. And they did. Through the flak bursts, through the smoke, through the shockwaves of exploding bombers, they kept their formation. Bomb bay doors opened. The bombardiers adjusted the Norden crosshairs. And then, in sequence, they dropped. From 25,000 feet, the city below transformed into a grid of destruction. Bombs cascaded into the Messerschmitt assembly halls at Regensburg, tearing through hangars and fuel tanks. Entire production lines collapsed in seconds. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, Germany's most produced fighter, suddenly lost its cradle of birth. Witnesses later described the attack as surgical apocalypse. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, the second wave struck Schweinfurt. It was a city that powered the Reich's war machine. Its factories produced nearly half of all Germany's ball bearings. Without them, tank engines, aircraft propellers, and submarine shafts would grind to a halt. American planners had calculated the stakes precisely. One good strike, they believed, could paralyze the German war effort for months. But Schweinfurt was heavily defended. Anti-aircraft batteries lined the hills, and Luftwaffe interceptors swarmed the skies like hornets. The B-17s pressed on, losing plane after plane. Crews watched their friends vanish in blossoms of flame. One formation lost 12 bombers in 5 minutes. Still, the survivors flew through the smoke, their formations ragged but determined. When they released their bombs, the impact was catastrophic. The Kugelfischer and SKF factories burned for days. Production dropped by 38% in a single month. The cost was staggering: 60 bombers lost, 600 men dead or missing, many captured. German propaganda trumpeted it as a victory, the American massacre. But behind closed doors, Reich Armaments Minister Albert Speer studied the reports and paled. "The blow to Schweinfurt is grave," he wrote. "We cannot replace such losses quickly." What the Germans failed to see was that this was only the beginning. While the Luftwaffe scrambled to repair its factories, American engineers were already solving the problems that had nearly doomed the mission. Range was one. The B-17 could not yet reach deep into Germany and return safely without heavy losses. So the Americans turned to innovation again. Engineers at North American Aviation began modifying the P-51 Mustang, fitting it with a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The result was a fighter that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. At the same time, the Army Air Forces refined formation tactics. They introduced tighter combat box groupings, giving every bomber overlapping fields of fire. Each formation became a fortress within a fortress. Gunners trained relentlessly, guided by instructors who filmed practice runs and analyzed every tracer pattern. Radio discipline became sacred: no chatter, no panic. Each mission taught new lessons. Maintenance crews re-engineered engine cowlings to withstand high-altitude freezing. Factory teams improved self-sealing fuel tanks and added armor beneath pilot seats. Every change, every rivet, came from the same invisible army of technicians, engineers, and workers who transformed defeat into dominance. The Germans, meanwhile, grew desperate. Fighter losses climbed as new American tactics shredded their attacks. By late 1943, one Luftwaffe officer admitted, "We shoot them down, and the next day there are more." Their fuel reserves dwindled. Their pilots, once Europe's best, began to die faster than they could be replaced. The tide of the air war was turning, not just through bravery, but through technology, organization, and relentless adaptation. The Americans had forged a machine of war so vast, so coordinated, that even the most disciplined defenders could not hold back the tide forever. And as winter 1943 turned to spring, whispers began across Allied bases in England: Berlin was next. In the first light of March 6, 1944, the rumble of engines once again filled the English countryside. At Thorpe Abbotts, Bassingbourn, Kimbolton, and dozens of other airfields, crews prepared for the mission they had trained and bled for: the assault on Berlin itself. Mechanics wiped frost from the wings, fueling trucks hissed as they topped off the giant tanks, and flight crews huddled in briefing rooms as maps were unrolled under red lamps. The target circle, drawn in thick pencil, sat over the black heart of the Reich. The Big B. Berlin. By dawn, 730 bombers were airborne. They rose like a steel tide through the overcast, escorted now by the new long-range P-51 Mustangs. This time, the flying fortresses would not go alone. The Mustangs, sleek, silver predators, climbed above and around the bombers, diving on any German fighters that dared approach. To many in the Luftwaffe command, it was the beginning of the end. The German capital was soon cloaked in the thunder of engines. Air raid sirens wailed across the Tiergarten, through Tempelhof, through the factory districts of Simonstadt and Spandau. Hitler's empire, once untouchable, now trembled beneath American steel. The bombs fell in waves: factories, marshalling yards, armaments plants, all shattered. Berliners who once mocked the idea of an American air threat now huddled in basements as the walls shook. "We could feel the sky falling," one survivor later recalled. The air itself roared. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. The Reich's propaganda had promised that Germany's borders were shielded by invincible fighters and impregnable flak. Yet here were the Americans, broad daylight, unflinching, dropping thousands of tons of bombs onto the Führer's doorstep. Fear crept through the population, and worse, through the ranks of the Luftwaffe itself. In captured diaries after the war, many German pilots confessed a grim realization. "We cannot stop them," one wrote in March 1944. "Each time we destroy 10, 20 more arrive. Their production is endless. Their spirit unbroken." For the first time, the Luftwaffe, the pride of Hitler's Blitzkrieg, felt powerless. Meanwhile, Allied command in England monitored the results with cold precision. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed the devastation: power plants, aircraft works, and industrial suburbs burned for days. The loss of synthetic fuel plants crippled Luftwaffe operations. Aircraft production plummeted 60% by mid-1944. Factories that had once turned out hundreds of Messerschmitts a month now sat in ruins. The very engine of German war was seizing up. But the cost for the men flying these missions remained brutal. Bomber crews still faced flak bursts that filled the air with shrapnel and fire. Engines failed, wings tore apart, and parachutes blossomed over enemy fields. The casualty rate for U.S. bomber crews over Europe was 20%, higher than for infantry in Normandy. For many, survival on a 25-mission tour was a mathematical miracle. And yet they went, mission after mission. Behind the front lines, the true miracle was industrial. America's war machine had reached a level of production that dwarfed anything in history. In 1944 alone, Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed produced over 12,000 B-17s. The Detroit arsenal churned out tanks. The Ford Willow Run plant built B-24 Liberators at a rate of 1 per hour. Every rivet, every shell, every drop of high-octane fuel represented a nation mobilized for total war. In hidden corners of factories, women worked through the night, faces streaked with oil and sweat. In foundries, molten aluminum poured into molds for new wings. On airfields, mechanics with blackened hands replaced engines by flashlight. Each unseen worker became part of the same invisible formation that crossed the skies above Europe. The war was no longer fought by generals alone, it was fought by machinists, electricians, and engineers who gave the airmen the tools to endure. Their combined efforts created what strategists would later call industrial warfare in the air, the capacity not just to destroy, but to rebuild faster than the enemy could recover. The Luftwaffe had bravery and experience. The Americans had abundance and precision. And in the calculus of total war, precision and abundance would win. By late spring, the German air defense network was collapsing. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons. Veteran pilots were dead, replaced by teenagers with barely 40 hours of flight time. The once terrifying 88mm flak guns fell silent for lack of ammunition. In desperation, the Germans turned to vengeance weapons, the V-1 and V-2 rockets, but they could not stop the bombers. The Reich was burning from within. Even Albert Speer, the master of German armaments, later confessed the hopelessness of the situation. From the day they reached Berlin, we knew the war was lost. In the summer of 1944, as Allied armies stormed Normandy and Soviet forces pushed from the east, the skies above Germany became a symbol of inevitability. The contrails of B-17 stretched endlessly, white scars across a dying empire. Where those trails converged, cities disappeared. Hamburg, Leipzig, Dresden, all paid the price of total war. But for the airmen who survived, victory came with a heavy burden. They carried the memory of comrades who never returned, the empty bunks, the folded uniforms, the silence of the mess hall. They had watched the world burn beneath them, watched fire consume cities, watched courage and terror intertwine in every mission. And though history would celebrate their triumph, they never forgot its cost. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the once mocked, weak American Air Force stood as one of the most powerful in history. It had helped cripple the Third Reich's industry, shattered its morale, and paved the way for liberation across Europe. Out of 12,731 B-17s built, over 4,700 were lost in combat. Tens of thousands of airmen never came home. But their sacrifice had transformed not just the war, but the very concept of air power. From that experience emerged a new doctrine, the belief that wars could be decided from the air. It would shape the Cold War's Strategic Air Command, influence the design of nuclear bombers like the B-52, and echo decades later in the precision strikes of the Gulf War. The lesson was clear: in modern war, the side that controls the skies controls the outcome. Yet even amidst that triumph, a deeper truth lingered. The power that could level cities could also remake them. Out of the ashes of Europe, a new order emerged, built on deterrence, not domination. The bombers that once rained destruction now symbolized the fragile balance of peace. In the quiet years after the war, as veterans aged and factories turned to civilian work, the stories of those missions faded into legend. But in museums and airshows, the sound of a restored B-17 engine, deep, steady, unmistakable, still stirs something in those who hear it. It is the echo of a time when courage met steel, when nations wagered their futures in the clouds. One surviving pilot, interviewed in the 1980s, looked skyward as a B-17 passed overhead. His voice trembled. "We thought we were ending war," he said. "But what we really did was change it forever." Dramatized. In the end, the Germans who mocked America's weak air force learned the ultimate truth of modern warfare: Strength is not only measured by muscle or machines, but by the will to build, to endure, and to never stop coming. And above the ruins of their once proud factories, the contrails of thousands of flying fortresses still lingered, white ghosts across a defeated sky.